A message to protesters. We are going to be getting reparations. I believe African Americans and Native Americans. And I believe our version of these folks all over the world. So to you protesters, do not loot, do not steal, do not hit anybody with a bat, shoot anybody, or try to run over any law enforcement. Reason being, God is so fed up with African American lives and Native American lives being destroyed that God has decided to chasten the majority persuasion, which is people with money, through COVID in part, but ultimately the chastening that God has brought to this world and will continue to bring to this world, I believe and am convinced, is that people with money will not be able to spend their money. Their options will become more and more limited by things that God brings about. It may be through natural disasters. It may be through lockdowns. There's a myriad ways, and I don't want to suggest how those are, that God is going to be chastening other people. Chastening people with money every time a black African American life is lost or a Native American life is lost. God will also not respect people's property nor their possessions. In some instances, God will raise their property to the ground, as we've seen through fires. In other instances, God will leave their property underwater. This is what God is going to do every time a black African American life is lost or a Native American life is lost in this country. This extends to other people, okay? For which God is chastening the whole world, okay? It is because of, I'll go into that later. If you folks loot and steal and destroy property, okay? If you don't respect people's property, leave people's possessions and their property safe and sound where they should be, if you do not leave law enforcement safe and sound as they should be, God is going to pull back their wrath because you have chosen to judge. You saw what happened in Portland, in Seattle. They weren't enjoying their lattes, okay, in San Francisco, in other parts of the world, storms and fires. God will continue to do this every time an African American, a black African American, or Native American life is destroyed. God is going to destroy their property, their possessions. God may choose to raise them off the face of the earth. But if you do some of these things that I've said, God is going to pull back their wrath, and God will not do it. A good example is this beautiful man, as a man with mental illness, NeonEli'shuaX. I am a man with mental illness. To see what they did to Mr. Chavez, and I've had similar, not as extreme as Mr. Chavez's, but I have had out of control moments that were a fraction of his, where I'm screaming and cussing and whatnot. Average U.S. citizens handled it better than what those police officers did, and they, for the most part, didn't make the situation worse. We have a right to exist. Black African American men with mental illness have a right to exist. We have a right to be in public. And sometimes if we have an episode, we have a right to do that, especially if we're not really harming anybody. So I've been safe. My God has protected me, and things have not gotten to where anybody's gotten hurt. So I'm fine. But seeing what they did to Mr. Nicholas Chavez in Houston is a perfect example. People's property was left safe and sound by Black African Americans and by people who were so upset about that murder by law enforcement. And God rendered God's chastening. And that was much of Houston was left underwater. Why? Because protesters left the city of Houston in peace. And yet, I don't know that anybody protested, because who cares about a Black African American man with mental illness? That was something that you would see, that you wouldn't see in a Disney movie, and that's how he was behaving. Who wants to fend for him? Well, God does, because God is going to chasten this world every time a Black African American life or Native American life is destroyed. God is going to do the same thing to their property, to their possessions, okay? And God is going to continue to limit the ways in which they can enjoy or spend their money, the things that they're able to buy and get access to. God is going to take away a lot of their fun and their ability to enjoy their money. So what I would tell African Americans, okay, 4 things really quickly. Folks who are homeless, people who are enslaved inside the U.S. and outside of the U.S. Most garment factory workers in the U.S., slave labor. They're paid about half a minimum wage. Same thing for farm workers. Dear Heavenly Father God, please saturate that situation with peace. In Yeshua's holy name, I pray, amen, gloria a Dios. A quick little prayer for an emergency vehicle. Paid about half a minimum wage and less. They do not live like in anything that's like decent housing. For people who are starving, and for people who have suffered gentrification. My particular district, my part of the district I live in, gentrification didn't work, so my neighborhood has not changed, thank God. The stores are still the same, at least within walking distance, within 3, 4, 5 blocks. Everything's the same, thank God. But much of the outskirts of my district was gentrified. So a lot of businesses closed and they reopened, they put in new buildings. So people who have suffered gentrification, as well as people who are suffering from starvation, gentrification, slavery, and God is reaching out to 4 different categories of people, just in general, okay? Slaves, enslaved people, starving, folks who are starving, folks who are homeless, and folks who are people who are enslaved, people who are starving, people who are homeless, and people who are, oh my gosh, there's another group of people that God is furious with the way we have helped these folks, because we haven't helped them, okay? And forgive me, I probably did mention the 4th group earlier. Hopefully it'll come back to me. But on top of that, God is furious with us not having gotten reparations. 41%, just over 41% of African Americans live, well, the majority of African Americans live working class and below. Just over 41% of us receive at least one form of government assistance. I receive 5, okay, because of my mental illness. So God is furious about how the way these groups have been treated. And then Native Americans and Black African Americans, God is furious. So God is going to be chastening chastening them every time. If you are peaceful in your protests and you do civil disobedience, similar to what Reverend Dr. King did, similar to what Gandhi did, God will condone that. That's fine. Okay, if you really need to get out there and do civil disobedience, that's how you do it. Okay. Best wishes to you. Okay, folks. Respect people's property, respect people's possessions, respect people's person, respect law enforcement. Okay, if you want to be a badass, Read about Reverend Dr. King Jr., read about Gandhi, and figure out how they did civil disobedience, and figure out how to apply it today.